We must return our prairies to deep-rooted perennial grasses and away from annuals, for example. But the recent successful attempts to grow nothing but perennial soy forever, sustainably in the tropics, is one of the worst things that could have happened to the fate of the forest. The vegans and vegetarians are, of course, quite right when they criticize concentrated animal feedlots, saying the plants we grow should feed humans rather than being grown to feed animals to feed humans, and none of us should be eating animals that are fed annual wheat, rice, corn, or other grains, or soy. But by that same token, given the ecological and health effects of grains and soy, no human should be eating these products either. The solution, of course, is agroforestry and silvopastoral systems, but politically, these are very difficult to get traction behind because such systems require a substantial upfront investment, and the sunk costs take years to be recouped, given how long it takes to grow tree cereals and tree protein in fruits and berries and nuts and establish permaculture. However, once mature systems are in place, it is quite possible that the win-win of it all will convince powerful enough political actors. After all, and for the record, as I stated in the last lecture and want to be sure because it's so important that you internalize, cows don't really like grass at all and much prefer and do better nutritionally wandering through rows of shrubs and trees, browsing on the leaves and twigs and shoots the way deer and elk do. Remember, the eastern cows, the European cows that now dominate the West, were not grassland animals like the bison that they replaced after the politicians representing the white settlers hired Buffalo Bill Cody and the U.S. Army to drive them to extinction as a political act to destroy Native American self-sufficiency. There are African and Middle Eastern bovines that had adapted to grasslands, but the European cow descended from the auroch, all of whom were killed off during the Enclosure Acts when European royalty drove peasants off their lands, goodbye indigenous knowledge, and fenced off the forests, spawning the rise of rebels like legendary Robin Hood and his merry men. The auroch that has been worshipped and used as a food source for millennia by the Celtic Druidic forest people and had thrived when people lived among them couldn't survive the wholesale conversion of Europe's wooded lands to the grain agriculture introduced from the Middle East and the European expansion. Discover magazine tells us, quote, by the early 17th century, the final holdouts of aurochs survived in the Jaktaro forest in Poland, protected by noblemen who also liked to hunt them. The death of the last aurochs in 1627 was also the world's first recorded extinction, end quote. As I've said today, I regularly witness OJ, the bull we have at Rosebud, rearing up on his hind legs with his front hooves on the big trees we have here, getting a nibble on the oak leaves within his reach. If he's grazing peacefully on a patch of fresh grass and I grab some oak branches and wave them at him from across the field, he will drop what he's doing and make a run for me to get at this tasty treat. And yet, Rosebud is plagued by an exotic, invasive, non-native grass called Kogon grass, Imperata cylindrica, that was brought to Florida by the Agricultural Extension Agency of UF in the 1930s when Florida was starting to be used to finish off industrial cattle so they could be advertised as grass-fed beef on the market. Now, nobody thought to create plantations of Florida native oaks and other trees and shrubs that cattle loved. Instead, they cut the trees and drained the swamps and planted Kogon. It was done for political reasons. You can read more about it in Grasslands and Climate Change, Chapter 16, Climate Change and the Politics and Science of Traditional Grassland Management from Part 3, Dealing with Climate Change Effects by Michael R. Duff. Kogon grass is now considered a threat. The cows hated it. It cuts their tongues with its sharp, indestructible blades, and it crowds out all the edible plants with its impenetrable root mat. Such an irony. At the same time, Florida communities get fined up to $500 a day if the beautiful native wildflower Biden's alba, aka shepherd's needles or butterfly needles or Spanish needles, grows over 6 inches, as happened to 84-year-old National Geographic explorer Dr. Sylvia Earle when she left to dive under the Antarctic ice shelf to examine climate change impacts last year. She came home to a $28,000 fine. But when we grab a handful of these shepherd's needles, these shrubs, We don't have sheep, but if we offer them to OJ and his mate or to the goats from across the field at Rosebud, they also immediately abandon grazing and trot over to get this wonderfully prolific treat that revives the soil and is our beehive's favorite flower as well. You see, the inclusive rule of the forest is quite different from the so-called competitive law of the jungle. A forest is a self-reinforcing, self-sustaining system that maximizes productivity. It should be used as an analogy for how our politics should work. It co-evolves in an e pluribus unum way that creates a unified whole out of biodiversity, a united states of being for each state of being. It is a metaphor for the way we should run our lives. Is it no wonder then that the capital city of Guatemala at the height of Mayan civilization was Iximche, which means the breadnut tree, the tree of life? Doesn't it say something about a people's politics when they name their political capitals after something life-sustaining? When I had just graduated from college and was on a Michael C. Rockefeller Fellowship doing research in the primary rainforests of Borneo in the Far East, I wrote a letter about what I was experiencing to Harvard psychology professor B.F. Skinner, whose book Walled In 2, about an attempt to take Thoreau's idea of nature at forested Walden Pond, Wald means forest in German, in Massachusetts, and turn them into a thriving ecological community, was one of the books in the big suitcase full of utopian literature books I hauled to the jungle from London so I'd have something to read at night by lamplight as I studied rainforest ecology from inside. The combination of ecology by day and a deep dive into the politics of sustainability at night led me to some big epiphanies that have stayed to this day, and I explored them all in a long letter to Dr. Skinner that I typed on the primitive manual typewriter we had in the jungle where we had no electricity or running water for the year, with the exception of 2 solar panels I maintained at base camp for the data computer. I had been scuba diving in Malaysia a month or 2 before arriving in Borneo, working with an ecological restoration project to remove invasive crown-of-thorns starfish that were responding to climate changes by multiplying and destroying the reefs. My letter explained to Dr. Skinner how I was coming to think that if we could design our cities based on coral reef and rainforest ecologies with their stacked functions and overlapping and redundant and self-reinforcing systems, and if we could design our politics based on the principles of symbiosis and mutualism and coevolution that I saw in the mature and intact parts of the forest and reef, where parasitism was at a minimum, disturbance species were kept in check, not eradicated, playing the ecological role they evolved to play without damaging the overall stasis of the climax community, and even commensalism, where one party benefits and another doesn't but isn't made worse off, is at a low frequency, then we truly would have a utopia. I asked him what he thought, and it took 5 weeks for my letter to get to the US and then 5 weeks for his answer to come back. But in his reply, he called me, a 23-year-old recent college graduate, Dr. Culhane, his kind of Skinnerian positive reinforcement, and encouraged me to continue down this fruitful path of inquiry and strive to put these ideas into action. And so, here I am today. Here I am, having lived in rainforests and explored coral reefs, confident that the English political philosopher Hobbes, whom we studied freshman year at Harvard, was quite wrong when he described life in nature as nasty, brutish, and short. And Lord Tennyson was quite wrong when he described nature as red in tooth and claw. Predation exists and parasitism exists, but they're not the inviolate law of the forest, only the law of the disturbed jungle, where disorder and disturbance cause a struggle for existence. In time, when allowed, much more complex and subtle relationships evolve, creating the foundation for emotions like love and charity and respect. Altruism. We humans spent hundreds of thousands of years going back and forth between forest and savanna as the climate changed, and we learned a lot from those shifts, mostly preferring to get back to Eden when we could. It was only about 10,000 years ago when one group in the Middle East seems to have gotten addicted to annual grains and created a way of thinking about the world that is more akin to the way locusts operate than the way most humans do. We know that because when the people of the Middle East and then Europe started to extend their empires west and south, they kept running into peoples who'd kept their forests and continued to thrive within them. And curiously, when they headed further east to Southeast Asia, to Borneo, they found that not only were there people who had never left the forest, But there were also people who actually left the fields to get back to it. I learned this during my studies in anthropology and my time in Indonesia, and I'll end with this. As I mentioned early on in this course, neither ecological nor political conditions are really affected by longitude. If anything, just as with ecology, there's been much more convergent evolution of political systems between West and East when the ecologies they are founded in are also similar. Forest people, tree huggers, are remarkably self-similar, East or West. And the defining characteristic seems to be how far they are from the centers of agriculture-based political power. For this reason, regardless of which hemisphere you live in or which quarter sphere, you're more likely to share political ideas with people whose subsistence base is similar to yours. Another great series of books I read in college and graduate school were Isaac Asimov's tomes on history, which culminated in his Asimov's Chronology of the World, the history of the world from the Big Bang to modern times. Asimov opened my eyes to the reality that in actuality, capitalism, socialism, and communism were actually the same system, an extractive system of oligarchic control and accumulation of power, whose shifting parts played with and against one another as part of a coherent, if brutal, whole. The notion was echoed in my later graduate school readings of the 19th century economic philosopher Leon Walras, who formulated the marginal theory of value and pioneered the development of general equilibrium theory, and the work of André Gunderfrank, who promoted dependency theory after 1970 and world systems theory after 1984. The basic idea is that supposed antipodes of political economy, modern capitalism and communism, are merely two sides of the same coin used in the currency of power consolidation. If there really are two political ideas that truly oppose one another and have relevance in the age of climate disruption, it would be the two identified by Daniel Quinn, an award-winning author who was a friend of my dad's when they were journalists together, in his parable Ishmael from 1992. Quinn in that book has a speaking gorilla tell humanity the real distinction, which is between levers and takers. Capitalists, socialists, communists, fascists, and certainly agriculturalists are what Quinn calls taker societies. Their politics is the politics of profit, of accumulation at any cost. Meanwhile, forest societies and hunter-gatherers in general are levers, whose politics revolves around ensuring the system sustains so that resources are left there from 7 generations into perpetuity. And this is why West or East doesn't really matter at all, and for that matter, neither does North or South, for it all comes down to subsistence strategy.